Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and the best way to encourage the youths of today. At a corner table by the fire are two people. One of them is waiting for the other person to laugh at his movie reference. But then he realizes that movie came out about 12 years before that person was born. And that old person is me, Matthew Millema. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. Now, I'm guessing all of you listeners have young writers in your lives. Maybe it's a child, a grandchild, niece or nephew, family friend, kid at church. Heck, maybe you are the young writer. I don't know where y'all are in your journey. Maybe that young writer's in first grade and using crayons to illustrate their first book, which is about a cartoon shark who's looking for a new home. That's what my son just did recently. Or maybe they're further along in looking to publish real and serious writing, like for real. Well, our guest today is certainly on the further along side of that continuum. She is still only 20 years old, but her third novel is debuting in just a few months. Her name is Millie Florence, and we are very happy to have her join us at the table. How are you, Millie?
I'm good. I'm so excited to be here. I don't know if you know, actually, but I found one of my publishers through your podcast.
What?
Yes. Bandersnatch.
Okay. Oh, good. Good. My book is coming out with Bandersnatch too.
Oh, really? Oh, that is so cool.
Yes.
Wait. Yes.
It actually comes out in just a few weeks. Red Rex available for pre-orders now. This is cool. I didn't know we had this connection when we, we set the interview up.
That is so neat. Yeah. So yeah, talking about encouraging young writers, one of the ways my parents encouraged me is my mom sent me the podcast episode where you guys interviewed Bandersnatch books, and that's how I found out about them, and that's why I ended up submitting to them.
Whoa, this has already become much more. Wow, okay, head exploding. This is amazing.
All the connections.
And listeners, just so you know, these connections are all real. I had no idea when we set this interview up. That's amazing.
Thought I'd surprise him.
So yes, as you can see, we are all of us, whether it's this podcast, Bandersnatch, or Millie herself, we're all anxious to help young writers. So Millie, let's talk about your books. Before we do, I have to know, just rip the Band-Aid off, that reference I made to the Utes. Did you recognize the movie reference?
No.
Okay, that's okay. It's my cousin Vinny. It's a good lawyer movie, but I wouldn't expect that of you. But anyway, let's just acknowledge that my oldness before we keep going. So Millie, I want to talk about the specifics, but before we do that, why don't you tell all the listeners a little bit about yourself, sort of the writing you do in broad strokes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I write books for middle graders. So a good age range is like 9 to 14, maybe, for my books. And I started very, very young. I've been obsessed with storytelling for as long as I can remember. Like, one of my earliest memories is of laying under the covers at night, whispering stories to myself long after my parents told me to go to sleep, which, not sure how much they appreciated that. But it did lead to me publishing my first book when I was 13 years old, Honey Butter. That was my first. And I just have not stopped since. And I've gone on to publish several more with Bandersnatch books, and my most recent book, it's actually a republication of a book I originally self-published when I was 15, which is cool, and it's getting republished by Waxwing Books, which is run by Sarah Mackenzie, which is a name some of you guys might recognize. And yeah, I write lots of whimsical middle grade fiction is how I would describe it.
That is great, and yes, shout out to the listeners there. If you're the sort of person who likes Bandersnatch or Believe to See, you're also going to like Waxwing and Sarah Mackenzie. So keep all that on your radar. So that is really cool. So let's start off by talking a little bit about your upcoming one, that this republishing. So let's see. Let me. So I did some delving into your Amazon publishing history.
Nice.
So the one that's coming out is Beyond Mulberry Glen. Is this a republishing of the one that was like person's name from Mulberry Glen? Am I connecting these together?
Yes. So originally the title was Lydia Green of Mulberry Glen when I
That's the
published
one.
it. Yes, when I was 15. So this is a republication of that, and the title is now Beyond Mulberry Glen. But it's not a sequel. I know it kind of sounds like a sequel if you know about both titles. It's the same story. Yeah.
Well, you see, it's Lydia. Then we go beyond Lydia, but no, that's not what's happening.
No, it's the same story. Lydia's still there. She's still the main character, and we get to follow her through all her adventures.
So that's cool. So let's talk about that. So you self-published at 15. Now it's being republished. You're 20, correct?
I'm 21 now. I just turned 21 recently. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, my intro's all ruined now. 21. So now you're 21. Going back and republishing it, did you make any changes to the text? And if so, what kind of changes did you do?
Yeah. So I went through edits with Waxwing and with Sarah, and some personal edits of my own, because obviously it was getting republished like years after I originally published it. So I've grown a lot as a writer, and there were some personal things I wanted to change about it as well. So yes, there are edits done to the book. It's actually decently shorter than when I originally published it. It's been trimmed down quite a bit. But the actual story itself has not changed. So anyone who has read the first book, they might catch some slight differences when they read the republication, but it's very much the same story, just some tightening of language and smoothing out of a few things now that I'm a better writer.
Yeah, this is actually really fascinating because, I know for me personally, I'm guessing a lot of the authors who are listening to this will feel the same way. I grew a ton as a writer between age 15 and age 21. So I'm guessing you've done something similar. So you mentioned some of the changes. Now, when you're saying that it got shorter, in what ways did it get shorter? Are we talking you cut specific scenes out, or are you just going through like, I don't need that adjective, don't need that adverb, I can trim this down? How did it get shorter?
So no, there were no scenes cut. But as you grow as a writer, one of the things that is kind of a sign of growth is you can do more with less. So what might originally have taken me 3 paragraphs to fully explain, I can now explain in 1 paragraph. It's sort of things like that. Just making things a bit more concise, roughly.
No, that totally makes sense. So now let's go back. We will be back to Beyond Mulberry Glen. I want to take it back to the beginning. So you published your first book at age 13. I'm guessing a lot of work goes into that process. So when do you go from this stage where, again, you're like in kindergarten, your first grade, you're making little books with crayons, to thinking, ooh, I should like publish a book? When does that transition happen?
Right. So I actually don't know exactly when that transition happened, because for as long as I can remember, I've wanted to publish a book. Like, it always just felt like the natural next step to me. I knew that I love to tell stories more than anything else in the world. I spent as much time as I possibly could telling stories and reading stories. So to me, it was just like, well, what do you do when you tell stories? You write books that go in the library. That's just what you do. So for me, it was always like, yes, someday I want to publish a book. Now, the transition for me was when it changed from someday to I'm going to publish one now. Because I think a lot of kids have those sort of someday dreams. What do you want to be when you grow up? And at some point it changed for me of like, no, I don't want to wait till I grow up. I want to do this now because I love doing this now. And I think I was about age 9 when I decided to start researching publication. And then it was when I wrote Honey Butter at age 13 that I got into it more seriously. Looked up self-publishing versus traditional publishing, was making all my pros and cons lists, eventually settled on self-publishing, chose Ingram Spark for my distributor, kind of figured out all the nitty-gritty details. So it was around that age, and it was with Honey Butter specifically, because prior to Honey Butter, I had always struggled to finish my stories because they were long and complicated, and I would get distracted by a new shiny idea. But with Honey Butter, I finally recognized that was kind of the thing that was holding me back, was that I could never finish anything. So I was like, I'm going to do it. I kind of set an ultimatum for myself. I'm like, I'm going to finish this one and I'm going to publish it. And so in order to finish it, I chose to write a very short, very simple story. Honey Butter is only about 150 pages printed. So that's what I did. And I tried to do it like really, really well, because I think often as young writers, if we attempt something more complicated, it can be more difficult for us to do it well. So I chose something simple that I could do really well. And I self-published it at age 13. That's the recap version.
So that makes a ton of sense, going from the big sprawling epic that you're not, none of us are ever going to finish, to like the more simple story. So what is the gist of the Honey Butter story? What made it more manageable for you?
So Honey Butter is the story of 7-year-old Jamie Johnson, who is obsessed with collecting paint cards. And then one day she meets the mysterious Lauren Lark, who is a homeschooler that lives next door, and it's about their summer adventures together. So as you can tell just from that, it's realistic fiction, takes place in the real world, very short. It's about two girls' friendship and their summer together and kind of the interpersonal relationships in each other's families, that sort of thing. So the premise was just very simple in comparison to the fantasy and sci-fi stuff I've been working on before. However, I do want to say this specifically. Honey Butter, I didn't stop with Honey Butter. Once you look at my later books, at Beyond Mulberry Glen and The Balter of Ashton Harper, my other book, they're more than twice the length of Honey Butter. They are fantasy. They have lots of like world building elements. Balter of Ashton Harper is historical, so I had to do a ton of research into the Regency era. Honey Butter was very much like a stepping stone book. I took what I learned from Honey Butter, and then I was able to write the grand fantasy novel of my dreams, which was Beyond Mulberry Glen.
So you dip your toe into the water with some shorter, more realistic fiction, like slice of life, and then once you're in the water, you're diving through all the world building, the Regency, the fairyland, all that stuff.
Exactly, yeah. Although I'm still quite proud of Honey Butter, to be honest. Like, even looking back now at 21, yes, I've grown a lot as a writer, but readers still love it, and honestly, I still love it, even if there are imperfections about it that I would write differently now. I think it's a very special book to me, and I'm very proud of it.
So that's a really interesting thing that got me thinking, because I wrote when I was 13. I didn't publish it. I just have them on my little scraps of notebook paper. But I will say, reading through those stories, I would write short, funny stories that involved a fictionalized me and my pet dog and pet cat.
Yeah.
I kind of think they're still funny. I'm not gonna lie. I'm reading, it's like, hey, that's a solid joke, 13-year-old Matt. So, do you get a similar feeling? Are there any parts where you go like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, or is it more like, oh, that was solid, good work, 13-year-old Millie?
I feel like it's usually more often, oh, that's solid, because you get distance from the story. When I was 13, I felt very like grown up, and then I think you kind of get, as they call it, adult amnesia as you get older, and you kind of. It's easy to forget what you felt like when you were 13. And so then sometimes I'll go back and I'll read through Honey Butter. I'm like, I wrote this when I was 13? That seems so young. And I'm doing exactly what 13-year-old me hated for other adults to do to me, which was like underestimate me. So it's ironic.
No, I think that is a really good point, and we'll get into more specific feedback for like adults of young writers. But I think that's a really good one to keep in mind. It's that it's very easy for all of us who, it's been a while since we were young, to forget what it's like to be 12, to be 13. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons I'm so glad that I have the old writing that I did, to just be like, oh, so that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a lot more complicated than I would have assumed, right? You kind of, like you said, it's easy to get adult amnesia and just assume that I wasn't thinking about important things or feeling difficult things when you're a kid. But kids, especially around that age, they do a lot more than we give them credit for often.
They do. And I think it's also part of like being an adult. You want to feel like, oh, I've grown so much and I've improved so much from all the mistakes I made. When if you look back and you really think about it, I think it takes kind of a certain humility to realize and admit that you're still the same person. You just have more experience.
Yeah. And I'd be interested to see how you think this translates. So, turns out me and you have a lot in common. We're both
Yes.
we both have books, middle grade books with Bandersnatch. But for me, when I'm writing middle grade, I feel like part of that is I almost never do anything that I feel like is writing down to my audience. Right?
Yes.
You know, like maybe there's one or two words that I'll cut out or something. But I feel like for a lot of it, whether it's the themes, the world building, the emotions, the danger elements, my general impression is I think kids can handle it. And I kind of want them to, I want it to be so they have to reach up to it. And I think that's a good thing for kids to have something that's just a little bit of a challenge that takes them seriously, that respects them, and that they kind of need to push themselves to do it. I think that's the sweet spot if you can get it for a middle grade book. At least that's what I'm trying for. What were your goals?
Oh yeah, I fully agree with all of that. And in some ways, like having Honey Butter that I wrote when I was 13 is really helpful for me as a middle grade writer. Because if I ever catch myself being like, oh, but would a kid actually have the ability to do this? Like talking about like the characters in my middle grade novel, I'm like, no, stop. You self-published a book when you were 13. This 13-year-old who grew up in this magical world could absolutely spy on the evil wizard and succeed, right? But no, I fully agree. I'm a big proponent for like, yeah, don't talk down to kids. They are so much more intelligent than adults give them credit for. And yes, I also agree with the reaching up thing. I think that's important too. And you'll also notice, especially in this day and age, lots of like middle grade aged kids will start reading YA. And I think that is partly because they often feel talked down to by middle grade books. And I think we should avoid that. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, what one more sign can you be that a kid wants to like reach up with their writing than if they're 13 reading a book featuring a 17-year-old, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
yes. I mean, I was reading The Hunger Games.
The preference is very clear. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's take a half step back in time now. Okay. So you told us about you've loved stories as long as you can remember. You deciding like when you're 9, you want to pursue this really. Let's go back in time even further. So I know there are a lot of folks here who are listening who are like, their kid is maybe, 6, 7, their grandkid, niece, nephew, kid at church, whatever. And they want to know, okay, how can I help facilitate this with my young writer? How can I help them flourish in the way that they are trying to? Were there things that your parents did? Were there things that looking back on you think were helpful? What are good things for young children to get them started on the storytelling path?
Absolutely. So a big thing, and this is such a simple thing, but it is so important, is to talk with them and listen to them when they're excited about stories. So I know, like, when I was a young writer, I would get obsessed with both the books I was writing and the books I was reading. And all I wanted to do was just like talk about them and tell my parents about the plot. And, oh, I don't like what this character is doing. And, oh, this plot twist was so cool. And make time for that. Like, because that will nurture a young writer, young storyteller more than anything. Even if the book they are talking about is like Warrior Cats, like it's kind of, you would consider it maybe not the best literature, whatever. That is still like teaching them about storytelling. So yeah, sit down and talk to them about it. Ask questions about things you don't understand in the story. And just let them rant to you about the stories that they love. Because even if it's not a book that they're writing, even if it's like a TV show or a movie or a video game that's the story they're getting into, they will still learn storytelling elements. They will learn about what makes a good story through discussing a story with someone else. Because discussions like that are such a huge part of the learning process. Even now, like, I kind of need to talk about my stories to fully understand what is going on in them. So I'll just like come into the kitchen, even now at 21, I've done this for years. I'll come into the kitchen while my mom is making dinner and be like, hey, I have a plot twist or like a plot point I'm trying to figure out in this book. Can I just talk to you about it for 15 minutes? And often by the end of it, she just has to listen. I'll have figured it out myself just by verbalizing it. So that is point number 1 I would make. I think it's so simple, but it's so important. It's just like, get excited with them and really enjoy listening to them be excited about stories.
Yeah, that is a great point number one to make. And that leads to an issue that you've probably seen, because I think me and you probably spend time in the same like internet spaces on like youth and books and stuff, where it seems like we have these two camps. One
Mhm.
camp is you need to carefully curate what your kids read, make sure you find the best stuff for them, make sure they're only exposed to the best, not like
Mhm.
the, like the junk food of reading. Then there's the other side. It's like, hey, just get your kids to read, okay?
Yeah.
Is it all going to be great literature? No, but it means that they love to read and then they'll learn all of this as they go. With the caveat, I'm sure we have listeners in both groups, and both sides have so much good to say, okay?
Yeah.
Which side of those camps do you come down more on?
Okay. Quite honestly, I would say you should encourage your kids to read things. So, like, encourage your kids to read the classics, but don't discourage them from reading the books you would consider aren't great literature. So, I'm kind of in the middle. And the reason for that is I grew up listening to, what was it? Anne of Green Gables, A Little Princess and the Secret Garden, those 3 audiobooks on repeat. That was the soundtrack of my childhood from ages 7 to 9. And I genuinely do think that that made a big difference in why I was able to do what I did so young, is because I was exposed to such great literature on such a constant basis. And especially because I listened to it over and over again, because you learn more from rereading books, right? That said, I also did read Warrior Cats, right? And and I like, I don't know, I have this very core memory of, there was a Minecraft role player I would watch on YouTube when I was younger. And he was like a dad who like role played in Minecraft, and he was like telling his own story through it. And I remember sitting there watching these episodes. And at some point I had the realization, this isn't the greatest story. I can actually tell a story better than that. I can do better than that. And that was a weird moment, but it like clicked for me. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm a good writer. And that like encouraged me to write more. So I'm also a big proponent of like, you can learn just as much from reading a bad book as you can from a good book. Because when the story is subpar, often that makes what makes a story work stand out even more than in a good book. Because in a good book, all the what's the word? All the work the author does should be invisible in a good book. So it just feels like it all flows together perfectly. In a bad book, that sort of thing can stand out more to you, and it forces you to think about, wait, why isn't this working? Why does this feel off? And then that forces you to learn more about storytelling, right? So I'd say both. Yes, definitely encourage your kids to read good literature because it's going to make a huge impact. But if they're obsessed with whatever, random book series with 10,000 books that just keep coming out, let them keep reading that too, because they will also learn from that.
No, I really like the way you phrase it. You're bridging the gap between the two camps, which I think is good. Where yes, we want the kids to read the great works of literature. Obviously, like this podcast would not exist if I didn't believe that some stories were great, right?
Yes, yeah.
But by the same token, kids aren't going to do that unless they first enjoy reading. So I think that's the first thing. You hook them to make sure, hey, buddies, reading is fun, stories are fun, these are good and important. Then once we have all that set, hey, here's some really, really good stories. And if they already like reading, they might think, oh, okay, well, yeah, let's go to if I like stories so much, these are supposed to be the best ones, so let's go with there. So they can't be mutually encouraging. And also, like you mentioned, you can like more than one thing, right?
Yes.
I think most of us, I'm guessing I speak for both of us, Millie, where we both probably read, serious literary books and sort of fun, lighter books too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, okay. And also taste is something that is taught, honestly. So like, this is another example of like something you can do to encourage your young writer. I read aloud a lot of books to my 9-year-old little sister. And in a lot of these books, like, they're good books because I always try to encourage books I feel like are really good to read aloud to her. But there, of course, with every book, no book is perfect. There's some stuff that occasionally doesn't work. And whenever she notices the stuff that doesn't work, I'm like, yes, you are learning. The student will become the master. And so I will ask her questions about the book. So like, we'll finish a chapter. I'm like, so what did you think of this character? Did they feel like a real person? And then we'll have a discussion about that. And if that character wasn't working, I'll be like, okay, well, why didn't they work? What would you do as a writer to make that better? And I think that's I think often recognizing where a book doesn't work is just a great learning opportunity. So.
No, absolutely. I also like the sort of other side of the coin there, where you're taking your 9-year-old sister's opinion seriously, right?
Oh yeah,
You're
yes. That's
asking
very
what she
important to
thinks,
me.
and then you're actually incorporating her thoughts because her thoughts are valuable to you.
Yes. Well, and also because this is a huge like homeschool philosophy of my mom's. Uh, the only education is self-education. I could lecture to her about why this works or doesn't work. Doesn't necessarily mean she's going to learn it, but if she has to figure it out herself, then she's definitely going to.
I like that. I like that. And now let's get to the whole homeschool thing too, because cards on the table. I was homeschooled. Um,
Nice.
my nieces and
Homeschool gang.
yeah, there you go, there you go. My nieces and nephew who live in the same town, they're homeschooled too. My kids go to a charter school in town here, so lots of different, very valuable options. I'm not dipping my toe into that debate, but let's look at it as things that you may have learned from your context of homeschooling that you find valuable, whether or not your kids are homeschooled, right?
Right. Yes. So a big thing I appreciated about homeschooling for me was the amount of time it gave me to pursue writing, to pursue what I was passionate about. That was huge because my parents were always really big on that. They wanted to give me and my siblings time to pursue the stuff we were passionate about. Again, another big philosophy, homeschooling philosophy of my parents is that they want our education to be delight directed. So it's not even so much how did homeschooling influence my writing, it's how did my writing influence my homeschool experience. Because I was so excited about writing and storytelling, they tried to connect as much of my education to writing and storytelling as possible because they knew that that would make me more likely to learn more if it was connected to something I was interested in. So just like a lot of history, for example, was framed through historical fiction novels or, lots of living books. It's just that's how I learned a lot. Even like when I learned Latin for my foreign language in high school, I ended up connecting that to my storytelling because Beyond Mulberry Glen has Latin in it. In my book, it is the official language of the fairies and the elves. So I had to learn Latin so that I could write it accurately into the book, right? So there was lots of stuff like that.
Okay, I have serious questions that involving the actual topic of the conversation. But first off, I have a world building question because I can't let that go. How come the elves and the fairies speak Latin in your world?
In my mind, it's because Latin in the real world is a dead language, and I like the idea of the fairies and the elves are so much more ancient than humans that they speak this language that we don't even know anymore.
Now, did the fairies and elves pick it up from the Romans, or maybe the Romans learned it from the fairies and elves? How does that go?
I'm leaning more towards the Romans learned it from the fairies and the elves.
Okay. So that would be great for all of us who speak a language with like romance elements involved. We could say we speak a fairy language. Ooh,
exactly. I wanted to make it more whimsical. Yeah.
All right. So now back to the main subject at hand.
Yes.
So I really like the way you put it, where you're encouraging people to follow their delight. I think you said was your parents'
delight
philosophy.
Directed.
Because yeah, there you go. Because I think a lot of times, and especially I think this happens as all of us, get further and further away from childhood, you have this impression where a lot of education is downloading facts into your brain. And some parts of that are important. In history, it's important to know certain dates. In science, it's important to know your periodic table, all that stuff. There's some things that you just need to know. But a big part of education is forming you into a person who can become a learner throughout their life, right? So teaching them the tools so they know what to do, and also giving them a love of learning so you just sort of go after it on your own. So it sounds like a lot of this stuff that you're doing, this is stuff you already enjoyed, and now you've just been given the tools to really go for it on your own.
Exactly. Well, and even so, I taught myself how to self-publish, how to do like the business side of things as well. And I learned how to be self-taught, how to be a learner from being homeschooled because there was such a focus on figuring things out on like yourself, on like becoming a learner, going after what you're interested in. So it's so interesting because I'll have authors like ask me, how did you figure this out at such a young age? And I was like, well, I Googled it. Like, I did what I had done my entire homeschool career when I wanted to learn about something, which was I checked out books from the library. I looked it up on the internet. I had discussions with my parents. Like, my parents gave me, exactly, the tools to learn more things, even just outside of curriculum, even outside of like high school subjects, so that now even in my adulthood, I still use those skills all the time whenever I want to learn something new. So yeah, definitely an overlap there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, those sort of skills, that's just part of being a mature adult, right? It's learning how to learn something that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, I can speak from personal experience. Going through the process of getting a book published is very complicated. I'm sure it was a very good education for 13-year-old you. Like, even down, like, I will tell you, when I was looking through your Amazon page ahead of this, I looked at your, like, the cover for Honey Butter. I was like, oh, that's a good cover. How'd she pull that off? Like, you really did a good job with it, which is really, really good when you're learning this cold as a 13-year-old.
Thank you. Well, so I will admit, the cover has been updated recently. It's much better now. But that was really more down to my budget at the age of 13, because I didn't have one. I have more of a budget at 21 than I do at 13. So this is a cool story, actually. So the artist who did the cover for Honey Butter, her name is Kelly McMorris. She's also a Christian and a homeschool graduate, and she's now homeschooling her own kids. And I was a huge fan of her art starting at age 11 and just have been ever since.
Oh, man.
So the fact that I, within the past couple years, finally got to hire her to illustrate one of my covers was a super cool, like, full circle moment.
Full circle.
Yeah.
That is, and I love the difference between the spending capacity of a 13-year-old and 21-year-olds pretty significant.
Yes, it
so
is.
I'm guessing your funds are a lot more substantial now. You have an art budget now.
Exactly, yeah.
All right. So that is great. So now let's get into some specific recommendations before we go. We're running a little low on time. Last set of questions. Like, let's say there's some kids out there, again, some parents who have kids, like say they're 8, 9, 10. They're just getting into this middle grade range. Mm-hmm. What are some titles? Let's assume all of my books and all of your books are head of the list, right? But
yeah, sure.
Putting those aside, what are some other books that you think are good for encouraging storytellers and getting good books in the hands of those kids?
Okay, awesome. So I love this question. My favorite book of all time is The Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Yes, I remember reading that and being like, this is the kind of book I want to write, just because it's so whimsical and clever and gives so much power and agency to the kids. Like, that's a book where the kid characters are taken very, very seriously, right? But it also just has these deeper messages to it. Like, it's this wonderful, amazing, exciting adventure, but it also has this deeper layer to it as well, that the author trusted the kids to be able to recognize, that he trusted those readers to be able to recognize the deeper messages in that as well. And I absolutely love that book for so many reasons. But I could go on about it for longer, but I'll keep going. I'll try. Okay, let me think if I can think of some titles. So this one I feel like is pretty underrated. A Dragon Used to Live Here by, what is her name? I think Anne Kate. That is a more recently published book, and I feel like it's super underrated because I never hear about it, but it's a super cute story about two kids who live in a castle, and they find out a dragon used to live in the castle, used to take over the castle. And they end up learning about their parents' backstory and how their parents met. And I don't know, it's super cool. It has lovely illustrations throughout. That was a super fun book.
Can I just say, outstanding title too.
Oh,
10
yeah.
out of 10 on the title.
Yeah, that's a fun one. Let's see. I'm a big fan of Kate DiCamillo. I'm sure lots of listeners know about that one as well. Howl's Moving
By the way,
Castle.
listeners, in case you're just listening to the audio, Millie is literally leaning back from her chair and looking at her bookshelf.
I am. It's right next to me. I keep all my middle grade books on one shelf. Yeah. Oh, what else? Oh, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon by Grace Lynn. That's another lovely one. That one also has dragons in it. My little sister's obsessed with dragons, so I think I've unintentionally curated a lot of dragon books just to read aloud to her. Sweep by Jonathan Auxier.
Okay, that one's been on my list for a while. I'm glad to hear that.
That's another one that's like wonderful adventure, but also really deep and will make you cry.
Okay.
So that's a good one too. And then, yeah, I said it earlier, but Howl's Moving Castle is another good one. That is just a lovely, whimsical fantasy adventure. I'm a big fan.
That is a good one. Absolutely. Okay, good. Look at us. Look at us with our random connections we didn't know about. I like all those books I sign off on. That's great.
So I think that means we're in the right place.
I think so. Right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, like I mentioned, we are just about out of time. So before I do my little closing spiel, Millie, where can we find you? Where can we find your books?
Absolutely. So the best place to go to find me is my website, millieflorence.com. And from there, you can find links to like my social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all the places. And also from my website, you can find all of my books. And you can actually download a free ebook and audiobook copy of my first book, Honey Butter, the one I wrote when I was 13 years old. When you go to my website, it should be the first thing you see. When you sign up for my newsletter, you get a free Honey Butter copy. So that's where I would recommend going, millieflorence.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. That is all great. And listeners, as you all can guess, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have an extra, say 30 seconds or so, please rate and review this show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.